morning, everyone, and welcome to Think Future. My name's Chris Kalabukas, and once again, we're coming at you live from deep in the heart, deep in the heart of Silicon Valley, California. We're talking innovation, startups, the future, not necessarily those, and not necessarily in that order. If you're watching on YouTube, smack that subscribe button and hit that bell so you can be notified when a new show comes online. And if you're listening on your favorite podcast service, please subscribe. Please drop a note on Apple Podcasts. I greatly appreciate it. Now, the reason why I did that was because I've been listening to some of my older shows. And if you don't know already, I'm over 700 episodes now. 700! All the way back to 2013. That is 10 years ago, my friends. 10 years ago. And I almost announced every show exactly the same way. Deep in the heart of Silicon Valley, California. Pretty deep. Can't get much deeper. So we're talking innovation, startups, the future. Not necessarily those, and not necessarily in that order. But of course, I said that already. So today is Startup Monday. That's right, folks. Startup Monday, the day after Super Bowl Sunday. I don't know. Not every Startup Monday is after Super Bowl Sunday, but today it is Super Bowl. It is the day after Super Bowl Sunday. It is Startup Monday. And today's Startup Monday was an idea that I was a part of a startup back in 2009. So in 2009, I was a part of a startup that was interested in developing new forward-thinking ideas for patent. And unfortunately, it was right after the Great Recession of 2008, and a lot of companies had reduced their spend on patentable ideas. So they weren't interested in expanding their patent portfolio. So at the time, we pivoted to do something different. At the time, Facebook and Twitter were super hot. Social networks were super hot. Even though MySpace had been around for a while, Facebook and Twitter were super hot. And one of the things that we noticed, our founding team noticed about Twitter and Facebook and things like that, is that especially with Twitter, you would miss so much unless you were always plugged into it. Unless you were plugged into it 7/24, you could miss everything. Something really interesting could happen on a topic that you would be interested in, and you'd miss it. You'd miss it if you weren't, because the things went by so fast. And Twitter hadn't really figured out how to design their algorithm in such a way that it would show you the stuff that's interesting to you. And if you ask me, they still have issues with that. That you'd miss things. You'd miss things. So this was the idea. The idea was this, is that if there was a particular topic that you were interested in, say, for example, sailing, what you would do is you would create something. You would create a search for sailing on our tool, which was called Tweebus. And what it would do is it would basically suck in the fire hose of tweets from everywhere. The entire fire hose of all Twitter tweets having to do with sailing. And it would go in there and it would determine, based on our proprietary algorithm, what people were talking about and what the most important things on the topic of sailing were. And what it would do is it would deliver you a report 24 hours later of the top most important stuff that people were talking about as it pertains to sailing. And you could go in there and you could create a Tweebus on any topic. So you could pick a topic and you put it in there, and then 24 hours later, it would have a snapshot of the top most important stuff that people were talking about on Twitter. Now, every time I describe this to somebody, they go, "Wow, Chris, that's a great idea. What happened to that?" Well, we ran it for a while, and we weren't able to pick up traction for it in 2009, but maybe nowadays, this is a useful tool. Maybe Twitter can provide this kind of service already. Maybe there's other tools that are out there that can do it just as well as we did. But there were some interesting twists that we put on at the time, which I don't know if would be interesting today to think about or not. So first twist that we put on was we assumed that the tweet itself was pointless. There was no point to the tweet. This is back when tweets were 128 characters only. We assumed that the important part of the tweet was not the tweet itself, but the payload attached to the tweet. So if there was a link on the tweet, so if I said something in a tweet, even if I said the most profound, the most interesting, the greatest thing ever on the topic, we would just discard it. We would say that's not important. If it had a payload, if it had a link to someplace, and a lot of people retweeted it, and really important people retweeted it, and if it was linked somewhere, we would follow the link, we would harvest the link, and we would go, this is an important piece of content. We basically ignored the tweet itself and only looked at the payload, figuring that Twitter is a great tool for disseminating information, but not so good as a content creation tool. Now, it may be different now, but at the time, that's what we did. And the other thing we did is we factored in all sorts of variables when it came to how often it was spread, who spread it, the number of times, how far out it went. It was a very complicated algorithm, and we were making it even more and more complicated and not getting so much more information from it. Now, this is a good example of a startup just suffering from featureitis. We just kept adding and adding and adding and adding features. We realized that we really should have gone to market earlier with an MVP that showed the power of the original core algorithm and then maybe added things on later. But that was the idea, and that's the idea I'm talking to you about today. So what do you think? Is now a good time for this kind of tool? Are there companies out there who would purchase a subscription to this kind of tool? Would it be useful to build this kind of tool today? Like I've always said, everything will happen. The only question is when. So maybe in 2009, this wasn't interesting or important to anybody. But maybe in 2023, things have changed. What do you think? That's it for me for today. See you next time, and until then, don't forget to think future.